let's talk about the different types of 3D figures. As I go through each type here, see if you can think of something in the real world that has this shape. So we're going to start with the prism, which the prism and the pyramid are both named by their bases, so they can look a lot of different ways. But for a prism, it's got two different bases, and then every other side is a rectangle. So notice in this one, this would be a triangular prism because the top and the bottom are both triangles, but then every other face on this is a rectangle. Those two bases don't have to be triangles though, they could be any shape. They just have to be exactly the same, so they'll be congruent, and they have to be parallel to each other. So you can't have one that's kind of like slanted. So the pyramid, also named by its base. However, all of the other faces in this are going to be triangles rather than rectangles, as with the prism, and that's why they meet at one point. Now for this one, since it's a triangular pyramid, technically I could have any of these faces be the base, but since it's sitting on that one, we'll go ahead and let that be the base. For both of these, it does not have to be sitting on the base for that to be the base, and we'll look at some examples of that in a minute. The cylinder is basically a circular prism. We're just not allowed to call it that because remember the prism has all other faces that are rectangles and the cylinder doesn't have that. The cone is similar to the cylinder in the fact that it's kind of like a circular pyramid. We're just not allowed to call it that because its other faces are not triangles. And then our last solid is the sphere. It's the only solid that we're going to talk about that does not have a base, and every point is equidistant from the center of it. So let's try naming some specific examples. So for each one of these, we're going to highlight the base of it, if it has a base, and then try to name it as specifically as possible. I'm going to do some with you, and then you're going to try some on your own. So looking at number one, that base, this one happens to be sitting on its base, but remember it doesn't have to be. All other shapes here are triangles and they come to a point, so it definitely is a pyramid. But because its base is rectangular, if I'm trying to be as specific as possible, I'm going to call it a rectangular pyramid. Number two, not sitting on its base, but definitely a cone. Number three does happen to be sitting on its bases. It has those two triangle bases that are parallel to each other. Every other side here is a rectangle. So this is a prism, but its bases were triangles, so it is a triangular prism. Okay. So looking at number four, it comes to a point, so it's looking like a pyramid, but then this is one that we're going to need to know how many sides this base has. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So our word for a six-sided polygon is a hexagon. So we're going to kind of turn this into this type of word and say hexagonal or hexagonal. I'm honestly not sure how it's pronounced. Go for it. Hexagonal or hexagonal. And it is a pyramid. Number 5 is sitting on its bases, and that is our cylinder. And then number 6, it kind of depends how you're looking at this. Technically the bases could be the bottom and the top, it could be the front and the back, it could be the side and the right side, left and right. I'm going to go ahead and make the bottom and the top our bases. And in that case, it is a prism. But in this case, if those are my bases, it's going to be a rectangular prism. And it did have the little marks to show that they were right angles, so I do know that it's a rectangle. Because it had those right angles, that means that the left and the right side are squares. So if I highlighted those as my bases, then I could technically call this a square prism as well, and that's not a big deal. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it on the 7 through 12. Okay, pause the video for a second. See if you can go ahead and name each one of these. Okay, so let's talk about each one of these. On number 7, we can tell that it's a prism, but make sure you're choosing those two faces that are parallel to each other and are not rectangles. So notice that like the left and the right faces, if they continued upward, they're going to cross at some point. So I can't choose the left and the right. The bottom and the top are parallel to each other, but they're not congruent. So we want to choose the trapezoids as the bases. They are congruent. They're not rectangles, and they're parallel to each other, which makes this a trapezoidal prism. Trapezoidal. For number 8, its base was a rectangle. You could say square. I think that might be a little bit of a stretch here, but we do know that it's a rectangle, so we'd say a rectangular pyramid. Number 9, the bases were pentagons, so a pentagonal prism or a pentagonal, however you want to say that. Number 10 is a triangular pyramid. Again, one of those where really I could choose any base here would work. 11 is a triangular prism. Again, be careful that you're choosing the bases not just because they're the bottom face, but because they're congruent to each other, they're parallel to each other, and it's the only faces here. These two are the only faces that are not rectangles. So triangular prism, and then our sphere.